So welcome everybody to our panel, and I also want to welcome our speakers. Before we start off our event today, I want to give a quick introduction for each of our speakers. So Dr. Stevens is a distinguished teaching professor at UT Austin. She's a professor in organization communication technology, and she directs the Optic Lab at UT Austin. Her research lab examines the role of technology in organizational practices and processes, and she's also the author of over 85 articles. Dr. Spar is the professor of business administration at Harvard Business School, as well as the senior associate dean of Harvard Business School Online. Her current research focuses on the relationship between technological change and broader social structures. And most importantly, she served as the president of Barnard College from 2008 to 2017. And finally, Dr. Twidale is a professor in the School of Information Science at UIUC. He was the founding director of the Masters of Science in Information Management, and he's currently the director of the Ph.D. program. And his research focuses on the intersection of computer-based cooperative work, human-computer interactions, and social technical systems design. All right, so once again, welcome our speakers, and let's get started with the questions. So it's been a year since we all started moving online to this new online environment, and I think it's safe to say that we've all had to adapt to different ways of interacting with each other. And there's definitely been a change in the way we interact with our students, our professors, our friends, our interviewers, if we're conducting interviews, and even our loved ones now that we're all online. So my first question to our panel is, how do you think that we have adapted to the lack of certain physical cues when we engage with others online? And by physical cues, I mean the gestures we make, our posture, our tone of voice, our eye contact. Dr. Stevens, you can start us off.
Okay, well, I actually started teaching about how to give a web conference in 2004. And I published articles, and I would go into class even up until 2019. And I would show students essentially what we're all doing right now, which is Zoom. And you know, we would talk about the trick that I always taught them is you take a sticky note, you put it up where your camera is to make sure that you maintain proper eye contact. You know, we would talk about audio. And then I went to teach my class last fall in the middle of a pandemic and went, oh crap, they know all this stuff. So I think that we've made massive changes in a short period of time in terms of how we communicate. But there's a lot of things we're missing and a lot of cues that happen in person that you just don't get online. And so a lot of the frustration that we feel, I think, is coming from that lack of cues. And it really doesn't matter if you're introverted or extroverted. The whole idea of being able to see a lot more context around you is just a different experience than seeing people in their little squares on Zoom. So we'll be studying what's happening here. We're in the middle of a great big social experiment right now.
Professor Twidale, you can add on.
Yeah, so firstly, one of the things that interests me is sort of the learning that goes on. Like, you know, how do you figure out this as you go along? And I think many of us have suddenly sort of had foisted on us a technology we'd never heard of before. Here's Zoom, use it. Okay, and now use it so well, you can stop thinking about using it and start doing the thing that the meeting was all about. And that's, you know, kind of stressful because, you know, it's like when if you remember first learning to drive a car, and it's like, I have to, you know, move my legs backwards and forwards to change gear, and apparently have to avoid, you know, hitting traffic at the same time. And then the driving instructor starts asking me questions. Like, for heaven's sakes, one thing at a time. So that process of learning how to do things is challenging. But, you know, I think we're often inclined to think that it's an individual thing, whereas actually it's kind of social. And I'm sure many people listening in have discovered that they have turned into the designated family technology expert, so that when things go wrong, you have to explain to your friends, work colleagues, family, relatives, how to do that thing in Zoom. But it's worse than that. You have to explain how to do that thing in Zoom while you're in Zoom. So how do you do that? And sometimes you can, there are techniques. We've often picked them up as we go along. But I think, I think we should be thinking more about how can we sort of facilitate this ongoing technology learning, because we always need to think, oh, you just have to learn one thing, be very hard, and then we're done. It's like, no, there'll be another thing along tomorrow. We'll be continually learning new things. And I don't think we spend enough time teaching people how to learn new things.
Yeah, I agree. And going back to Dr. Stevens' point about how, we're only seeing the top half of our body, like there's so much more going on with like hand movements and our posture that we can't see online. And back to your point, Professor Twidale, about how we're having to learn software that we're using at the same time. It's a very complicated process, and also something that I'm sure we've all had to go through. Professor Spar, I know that you run the Harvard Online Business School. I want to get your input about how online interactions have kind of played a role in that sense.
I'm sorry, how online what? I just didn't hear that word.
Yeah, online interactions and kind of how you've adapted it to the online environment.
Great, thank you. So I've been able to see this moment from two perspectives. So we had our online operations already in place, and then of course all of our offline operations also moved online. And I have to say they've actually been quite different. So the folks who decide to take classes online for a whole range of reasons, there was kind of no adjustment necessary. They're already, in that model, and it works really well. I mean, it's a very different model, but for the learners we have who were already taking, let's say, finance online, it works. And one of the things that I've been so fascinated to see is the folks who take our online courses, they make human connections. They know each other. Even if one guy lives in the Philippines and somebody else lives in North Carolina, they know each other, and they really feel like they have those bonds. I taught an online course for senior executives last week, and they bonded as well as any group that we would have brought to campus. So that's pretty amazing. I think what we've learned, for both better and worse, is that online education works. What doesn't work, and you all have gone through this, being on the Columbia campus at this moment, is that if you take people who thought they were getting an on-campus education and you thrust them into an online context, lots of things don't work as well. So in some weird ways, my experience has been the education still works. Like, as the faculty, we're slower, but as we kind of figure it out, you can learn your subjects online. What you miss is all the other parts of education. You miss Frisbee on the lawn, you miss sitting on the steps in front of alma mater, you miss going to the Hungarian pastry shop. I mean, you miss all those other things that are bundled into what we now think of as education. And some of that stuff we can replicate online. You can do breakout rooms, but you can't get back sitting on the steps. And hopefully, I'm enough of a Luddite to say we never want to lose that. So we want to go back to the on-campus life, but obviously take what we've learned about the online education piece, because not only does it work, it enables elite schools to reach far more people with a high quality education than would ever be possible in the purely on-campus side of our shops.
Yeah, that's interesting. I liked how you mentioned how the relationships that these seniors formed online in the online business school was, and you saw it was just as strong as those that were formed in person. And that's kind of like a question I want to shift to. So for Dr. Stevens and Dr. Twidale, in your eyes, would you say that the relationships that are formed online are the same strength and the same closeness that are as the relationships that are formed in person? And do you guys have any input on how we can make ourselves more approachable online and have these stronger relationships even in these remote conditions?
So I would say firstly, they're just different. And then it gets complicated because they merge, because like, you know, as we get out of the pandemic, we will switch to meeting face to face, but we will still be working online. So saying, okay, that's online and that's real life, it's a very weird distinction because it all smooshes around. But we've, you know, at our school, we've been teaching an online master's degree since 1996. I joined in 1997 and I was teaching online in the UK before I came to Illinois. So we'd done it, but again, just building on what Dr. Spar said, that made all the difference in the world, because these were people who were choosing to do a master's degree online because, you know, it was just not going to work for them to travel all the way to Champaign-Urbana to work with us face to face. And we knew this was going to be challenging. And way back then, nobody had ever done it before. So we had to explain what it was, how to be a student online, all of that. So we invested huge amounts of time and effort in community building. And so that the students who were sort of doing it, you know, from, you know, a small room in their house or on the kitchen table, studying for a very challenging master's degree, did not feel they were on their own. They're people they felt comfortable asking for help. And part of what we did was we insisted in the early days that everybody flew to Champaign for 2 weeks for what, you know, the students then called boot camp, where they took a course together, but we're showing them all the technology, but they were building all these social relationships, meeting people face to face. And it was much, much easier for them to continue those relationships online over the course of the master's degree. So that is one where, you know, we were firmly committed to online, and the first thing we do was say, you've got to come in person to get to know each other, because if you don't know each other, then it's not going to work. And so, you know, over the years, we've carried on doing that, so that, you know, when the pandemic hit, bizarrely, I was on sabbatical, so I was kind of watching this as a distance, but kind of frustrated because I wanted to travel and couldn't. But all my colleagues over spring break, it was like, okay, turn all your classes online. You've got 1 week, go. And of course, we've been teaching online for other stuff. So it's like, this is a bit of a bore. I suppose we're just going to have to, you know, convert everything to like we do on the online master's degree. So a bit annoying, but like everybody else who hadn't been teaching online was, oh my God, how do I do this in a week? You know, total freak out. But, you know, we'd, in a sense, had some experience with it. So the redesign was okay for us. The redesign was okay for some of our students who've taken online, but I would make the big distinction between what we have now is a lot of people who are involuntary online learners. They didn't sign up for this. And so when you don't sign up for it, all the little annoyances on the way become huge. Whereas, you know, when you did sign up for it, it's like, well, either I do it this way, or I don't get an education at all. So you have a very different perspective over little barriers along the way.
So I'll take this question and answer it kind of in a workplace context, because I think that's something that a lot of you will be experiencing, and you'll be having internships if you haven't already during the pandemic. We've also studied remote work for a very long time, since the 1990s, actually. And remote teams have worked, global teams have worked remotely and been very successful, just like the examples that both of the other faculty shared related to education. The challenge, whenever so many people were thrown online in the workforce, is that you had a lot of managers who had never managed people online. And so I taught an internship class as that was happening, and I watched students who were incredibly confused and frustrated. And I would often tell them, some of what you're feeling is that you're not getting the kind of management that you would normally. And so you feel a lot of their uncertainty because they're uncertain. I'll give you an example. One of my students wrote in her essay, she said, oh, I'm never going to do anything with remote work. This is horrible because my employer makes me, even though I have a 20-hour-a-week internship, I have to log on at 8 a.m. every day, turn my camera on, and I can't turn it off until 5 p.m. when everybody else does. And I immediately emailed her and said, we need to talk. That's not normal. Well, I'm convinced that it's because the manager was so paranoid of what people were doing and work hours that they had to micromanage them, and they were going to use the camera to do that. And so I think that unfortunately, a lot of you may have had some experiences that aren't real remote work, kind of like some of you have had online learning experiences that aren't real online robust learning programs. And so what we underestimate is that when things are done completely virtually or online, it takes a lot of work to make it work. But whenever that work is put in, it can work quite well for people.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of our lives is governed by, or a lot of our lives is, you know, online, but I feel like it's an incredibly different experience learning online and teaching online as opposed to just relaxing online and using social media. I want to shift a bit to screen fatigue because this is something that you know, we've all experienced, and it's also something that may affect our relationships because there's only so much time we can put to looking at someone online. So my question to all of you is, what stress does screen fatigue put on personal and professional relationships, and especially in the case of students in an educational setting? Dr. Stevens, you can start us off with this one.
Oh boy, I tell you, I keep combing the literature because lots of people have opinions out there about what they're saying right now, and we don't have a lot of empirical evidence for a lot of it. I would say that in general, if you want to say some of what's causing our screen fatigue that I believe, but like I said, there's not a lot of really hard empirical work out there that I'm aware of yet. A lot of it has to do with when you lose the context, like what I was talking about a while ago, and you can't see what people are doing, that feels a little uncomfortable. The idea of talking to someone and not seeing them, that's also really uncomfortable and very fatiguing for a lot of people. There's some evidence out there that watching yourself on video is also makes you that much more self-conscious. So if you can kind of hide your own video so you're not too obsessed with constantly looking at yourself or something, that can actually help a bit. But and the other thing is that we're sitting a lot. And a lot of times in the past, what we've been able to do is we have a lot of transition periods during our day where we get up and we move from one place to another. And you can literally sit at your chair the whole day and not move. And so that also contributes to fatigue because our body's not used to this. And so I think that it varies a lot between different people, but we just need to consider all of those different things and kind of play around with what works for us. Those are my thoughts.
So I'll chip in a few things. So the very early days of computer supported cooperative work, that's the late 80s, early 90s, the technology was very, very experimental. But what is so funny is the issues recur. And one of the things that was discovered time and again is people were trying to set up video conferencing, but the bandwidth wasn't all that wonderful. It was all a bit flaky. But what we learned through many, many studies consistently was, don't degrade the audio quality. The audio is what matters. And of course, what was happening was the computer scientists were trying to optimize for the video because video looks nice and flashy. Oh, look me, I'm doing video. Whereas if you do audio, it's like, you mean like a telephone, only worse. Yes, that's exactly it. We had audio that was lower quality than telephone quality and enormously lower than air across a room quality. And so part, and it's only part, but a part of why it is so fatiguing doing video conferencing, also why it's very fatiguing doing phone conferencing, is your brain has to work harder to understand what's going on because you've got a corrupted information source. You're having to reconstruct all those little noises and things that you're not aware of. And your brain is doing such a good job. So your brain's running around like a hamster in a wheel, trying to make this a smooth experience for you as possible. And then your brain is panting and it's like, oh, well, that was really tiring. Why am I so tired listening to somebody to talk? So that is one thing that still persists. And I think it's, we need to bear in mind it's part of the reason why we have a problem and why often we sort of skimp on high audio quality. And it's something I think, that we should all bear in mind. There's a bunch of others, but I'll pass on to the other speakers.
I'll just throw in a few more things. So I think a lot of this goes back to the difference between content that was built to be online and content that was sort of slammed online in a week.
Yeah.
So when we teach, let's say finance again online, it's very carefully choreographed. So you get a beautiful video and then you stop for a little exercise. And then there's a break where you take, you go get a cup of coffee. So it's built to be online. When you just take a class that's supposed to be in the classroom and you shove it online, everything goes wonky. And I think we have to be kind to ourselves and to Zoom. Zoom was never made to do this. We're using a platform that was designed for something completely different, and it's incredible it's worked as well as it has, but it's the wrong platform. And just, some of my favorite personal pet peeves, I can't see your reactions right now. There's, some number of people watching. I don't know if they're all bored. I don't know if they're, scrolling on their phones. Whereas if I'm talking to a real audience, I can gauge the reactions. I can see what's working. I can see what's not working. The other thing that does not work on Zoom is humor. Nothing is funny on Zoom. I can look around and see if you're, laughing a little bit, but, everything that works in real life, mannerisms, running around the room, humor, eye contact, it disappears. And then the last thing, and I'm certainly not a neuroscientist, but I think one of the other things that happens on Zoom is we can't shut off our peripheral vision, right? So we joke about the cats coming into the frame or the person walking, but I just find in terms of my bandwidth in my brain, I can't take it all in. When I had 93 people in my Zoom class last semester. And when everybody's got stuff going in the background, your brain just fries. I'll stop there. I could go on and complain, but I won't.
I just wanted to add to that, this issue of we suddenly have a new technology, as Professor Spar says, it's like we're appropriating that technology. We're using it in a way it was never intended, but it's what we've got. We've got to make do with it. But whenever we get a new technology, we're inclined to say, oh, what's it like? Well, it's like this other technology, only more technological. So, we had horses and buggies for a long time, and then we suddenly have automobiles, and we used to call them horseless carriages, and people would steer their automobiles with reins, because how else would you make it go left and right? And at a certain stage you realize that an automobile is not quite the same as a horse and buggy. Then we suddenly have movies, and it's like, okay, so this is like the regular theater, but we'll put a movie camera and we can record it, and then you can watch it in a movie theater, in rural Illinois, something that's happening, on the stage in New York City. And it's like, well, yeah, but actually over time we develop a new genre of cinema, which is not the same as watching people performing on a stage. And then we get radio, and then we get television, and television is not radio with pictures, but that's exactly how it started. And at the moment we're trying to do, teaching online. It's like, well, it's in a regular lecture theatre, but squished into Zoom. Or we're trying to do, working online, which would be like working in cubicles, but squished into Zoom. And over time, we can sort of develop something better. And as Professor Spar said, when it comes to designing online courses, we have developed them differently when we have some warning. But if you just copy it over, it's a miracle it works at all, but it's not terribly good.
Yeah, so kind of like the difference between content that's built for, for online versus content that's being forced to be made online. I think that makes a really big difference in the way we're able to, kind of the way that students are expected to learn, and also the way the professors are expected to teach. I I want to shift our focus a bit to kind of how we click with each other online. And I guess my question is, how do people determine what allows them to click with each other, especially in an online environment? And how has this made the process of socializing their job interviews easier or harder? So kind of like how we build relationships online and how you guys see how that's been made either easier or harder online. Professor Spar, you can start us off.
Yes, I'm going to start by going in an unconventional direction. Your generation, unlike our generation, knows an awful lot about how to meet people online because that's how you date. So, it's our generation that, for whom it's quite foreign to think of building strong emotional ties online. But you're the generation that grew up on having social media be a very powerful way in which you start human relationships. And I think that will sort of stand you in good stead as we move more and more of our lives, for better and worse, into this new environment. So clearly the work environment is not the same as the dating environment, but I do think people are increasingly going to get comfortable meeting each other online. It won't always work out, but it doesn't always work out in other cases. We're getting used to the fact of not evaluating people on height, which is sort of interesting, because the height has always been just sort of such an obvious initial part of someone's identity. But I have no idea how tall any of you are. But I think we're going to learn to make our relationships online. Again, they're not going to be the same, but can you make a connection online? Again, a third of all marriages right now are starting from online dating apps. And those are some of the strongest connections. So if people can figure out how to meet their life partner on a smartphone, they can make connections over Zoom as well.
Dr. Stevens, you can follow up.
Sure. And I agree very much with what Dr. Spar said. I guess one of the things that I have found interesting is last fall, whenever my students were interviewing for jobs for the first time online, I saw them at first kind of freak out a bit. And I even made videos for them to try to help them figure out, how do you take the fact that you're living in your bedroom and your bed is behind you? I mean, that's what most college students, that's where you have to do your Zoom calls. How do you make that feel like you're in a professional environment? Because some of when you're getting ready to interview is a mind game that you're playing with yourself. And so if you think you're at a disadvantage, it makes you at a disadvantage. But there's some really simple kind of tips that people can do to make their space feel a little bit more professional. And my students were very appreciative of those videos, and they were like, oh, this is helping us realize that we need to worry about lighting and we need to think about all these different things that matter when we're trying to form first impressions, which is usually what's happening with a job interview. But what I noticed happened over time is they got pretty good at it, and they landed jobs at the same rate that I have seen them before. The biggest change, though, was having to go through first round interviews where you're interviewed by artificial intelligence, and those online automated interviews. So I did a whole round of videos trying to coach them through that, because we're doing some research on hiring through AI right now. And I had my students coach each other around that. That was actually probably the hardest transition for them, because they felt like the human was taken out of the process and they felt like they were being judged unfairly. And so they had to get used to this idea of, an automated system asking them interview questions, and they have to be on cue and they have to respond. And I think that is a bigger transition than just interviewing people over video.
So I started looking at this in a field that was called computer supported cooperative work, because the assumption was these technologies are really, really expensive, and they're only going to be used in the work context. And frankly, in the early days of it in the 1990s, every example was oil executives having video conferencing meetings, between Houston and Lagos to save on an airfare, because like who else other than oil executive could afford to, do video conferencing? But of course, what I've realized since is these things are now pervading into, our homes because we're working from home, but also into our family lives. So again, as Professor Spar said, younger generation, large numbers of people date online, find people to date online, are actually having dates online during Zoom, but also lots of computer gaming where you're, interacting with someone and talking to someone who might be a very good friend or might be somebody you've never actually met, but you're interacting with them, you're having a fun time with them. So you're all doing this in a way that is very different from those who are older have experienced it. So my experience of, a lot of my online work is with people I know face to face, and they could be, all over the world, and we can collaborate and spin the work around the globe, exploiting the time zones, but I already know them. But, as things start to sort of bleed across into sort of family life, people are talking to family members and relatives using these technologies. And some of the pioneers of that were those of us who moved to different countries. And it used to be, you'd say goodbye to somebody, get on the boat, you might come back for a funeral and that's it. There are many stories. I've talked to some of my relatives. It's like you made one phone call at Christmas and it cost, $1 a minute in 1960s prices to have a coach. So it's like, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? Goodbye. And now it's like, it's free. So how various diasporic communities have stayed in touch as the price first of telephone calls collapsed, and now we have Zoom, which is near as damn it free once you've paid for your internet connection, and that's really, really changed. And now it's just spread out. People are connecting with wider family across generations. Bedtime story with grandma in Seattle is a real thing that people do, and that I think is really interesting because it then feeds back into the work life in ways I don't think we really understand yet.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. I want to go back to what you said about family life and also combine with Professor Spar. You talked a little bit about dating life and how dating has been affected by our online environment. And I want to focus on something that we might not immediately think about when we think about a virtual environment, and that's the role of gender. Professor Spar, I know you have a book called Work, Mate, Marry, Love, How Machines Shape Our Human Destiny. And I want to ask you, has the pandemic and the reliance on mainly virtual interactions sped up the dynamic between gender and could you go into a bit more detail about how this technological advancement has kind of influenced gender roles?
I think it's too early to tell, to be honest. If my basic hypothesis is right, that technological shifts manifest themselves in changing social structures, this moment is going to change gender and family in a whole range of ways. We don't know yet, it's still too early, but some of the early evidence, it kind of runs in both directions normatively. So on the one hand, it has allowed women to juggle work, family with perhaps a few more degrees of freedom. I've watched a couple of my students have become moms during this past year, and you could never manage to breastfeed a baby while you were a student at Harvard Business School. Now you actually can. So that's one small victory. But what we also know is women are dropping out of the workforce in droves right now because they're juggling so much that they're just dying. Because they're doing the housework, the schoolwork, and the work. So that's a very scary perspective. But I do think, I'm an optimist at heart, that over time, that as we start to, in some ways, we're going back to the pre-industrial revolution. In the pre-industrial revolution stage, there was no division between work and home. Everybody worked from home. The loom was in the living room, the sheep were in the living room, you know, there were no boundaries. In some ways, we're going back to that world. And I think hopefully a blurring of the division of labor between men and women. But again, it's still too early to tell. The other thing that I'm hopeful about, but I have not seen any evidence to suggest this is true, is will we see less sexual harassment on Zoom? You know, certainly the worst forms of sexual harassment can't exist on Zoom. I mean, there's no physical contact. But I have seen, apparently, I have some colleagues who are trying to get Zoom to actually release the data, because in theory, you can count who's speaking, who's taking more airtime, who's repeating whose comments and taking credit for them. Like, we can actually run that data now, but last I heard, Zoom is not willing to release it. But we will see whether the verbal interactions change when we move out of the physical office.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how, like you mentioned, like online learning has allowed women to learn from home more and kind of have more opportunities. But at the same time, that also puts a lot more pressure on women, having them having like more expectations to do a lot more now that they have access to a lot more stuff. Yeah. I was wondering if you can also expand on kind of like how maybe, I mean, initially this is very beneficial, it seems, but also like the additional pressure that women might face because of these new opportunities.
Yeah, well, and part of this that will hopefully go away is one of the reasons women have such burdens right now is because their kids are at home. So moms who have kids at home are just dying. So presumably once the pandemic gets to a point where the kids can go back to school, that I think then we'll have a window of opportunity to actually rethink this work-home balance in ways that should be good for both women and men. So there's a real opportunity here. Whether or not we take it is a different question. And I hope we don't find ourselves in a situation where the men decide to go back to the office and get all the promotions, and the women decide to take homes, you know, stay home so they can be there when, you know, kid gets off the bus, and they find themselves falling further and further behind in the workforce. But it is a moment where, you know, as I think Michael alluded to earlier, the technology itself has no normative component. You know, we the human beings have to figure out how to use this technology in productive ways. We have that opportunity right now. I just hope we seize it. And the we here has to really be employers and to some extent government in restructuring society in ways that allow us to take advantage of this thing rather than just becoming enslaved to it.
Right. I mean, that's all really intriguing. I know Dr. Stevens, your work also relates to this as well. I want to ask you, Dr. Stevens, your book, Negotiating Control, Organizations and Mobile Communication, it kind of discusses how at times it's difficult to communicate with people in the workplace. Now that, like we mentioned before, our home and work are entangled and in some cases like in the same place, how do you think this process has changed?
So I think one of the most interesting things that's happened about our mobile devices is they don't have to be mobile right now because we're not mobile. And so I'm actually kind of rethinking what that means, what mobile devices mean when you're at home. So that's kind of one thing that I think is kind of thought-provoking about the whole reason we went to mobile devices is so that they could go with us where we wanted to go, and now we can't go anywhere. But that'll change, you know, we'll get back to those kind of norms. The other thing is, I think that communicating in general it's hard, and people think it's easy. And it doesn't matter if we're in person or remote. It's a lot more challenging to really get our messages across sometimes than what we think. To me, one of the biggest differences, and I actually have this written kind of as a thought bubble on my whiteboard on my wall back there, is that the biggest difference right now is you can't have spontaneous conversations. Everything has to be planned. And so for you to ask somebody a question, you have to send them an email. And if you don't have their number, if they're a friend, you might text them, and this might go a little faster. But in a workplace, you send them an email, you schedule a Zoom, every conversation has to be planned. There's no spontaneity. And that changes the nature of the conversations that are had. It changes power dynamics because in possibly some concerning ways, because you don't have those opportunities for spontaneous conversations. So it's kind of my thinking on couple of different places that I'm going right now with this notion of mobility and spontaneous conversations.
Right. I mean, I think like what you said before, I think we've all had experiences where we're frantically emailing people last minute, and it would be so much easier if we could just go up and tell them what we want to say. I think just a final question. This one is for Dr. Twidale. We talked a lot about, or Dr. Stevens talked a lot about how, our mobile devices, they're made to be mobile, but now, they're made for us to sit down and do work for hours a day. And I know your work is focused a lot on having people together and learning technology together. How do you think this new remote work has kind of affected the social learning of technology? And do you foresee your research ever changing, like fundamentally changing in the future, or do you think it's still the same?
Yeah, that's a lovely question. So, I mean, my research trajectory started off looking at me building computer systems to teach other people things. And then I got interested in how do people learn how to use computer systems by looking at them. That's human computer interaction. If I as a designer do my job right, you can look at my new system I've built and you can guess how it works. And if I fail, you have to read a manual, if a manual exists, or go on a training course, which probably doesn't exist either. But it was like, how can I design it so you can figure it out on your own? Then I realized, well, a lot of the time, if you look in the workplace, when people get stuck, they ask the person in the next cubicle for help. And there's a huge amount of this learning, and it just didn't seem to be visible anywhere. The thing that people talked about was training courses. So like, well, what about all the learning that happens not in a training course? So that was the thing that got me really interested in that. And then I sort of realized it pops up in other places, not just the workplace, including, in academia, we think we're, the learning our students do is when I'm performing, at the front of the lecture theatre. And it's like, no, they're also learning from each other, and we could facilitate more of that. But, slowly getting to your point, the absolute revolution and what totally changed my understanding of how people learn tech was when the internet and Google really ramps up, so that now you're trying to learn a new technology, you'll say, well, I'll just press a few buttons. Can I guess right first time? No, I can't. Oh, now should I ask my friend in the next cubicle for help, or should I just type into Google? And it's like, okay, now you have three things you can do. You can try it out on your own, you can ask your friend for help, or you can Google. And of course, people do all three. So that has been the radical change. Now, Googling for tech help has popped up that never happened before. It works a lot of the time, but when your problem is, how do I get this Zoom to do that thing that I've seen other people do, but I don't know what it's called? How do you type that into Google and get something back? And what if what comes back is, well, first you have to edit the registry, and then you have to do this in Unity. It's like, well, that's an answer, but it's no use to me because I'm not techie enough. So, you can still be asking for help. So that bit, I think, is the search bit, is not a panacea, but it's very useful. And I think the only difference is I was thinking of this kind of social learning of tech happening in the workplace and at universities and schools. And of course, now it happens in the home and amongst the family. So if you can't get your phone to do the thing that you want it to do, you might ask your spouse or your kids or your techie nephew or your parents, and we're all helping each other out, even when we're not even in the same house, but part of a family. So that sort of intergenerational tech support, I think, is something that many of us are doing, but we don't really teach people how to give tech help efficiently, and we certainly don't teach people how to ask for tech. I was like, it don't work, help me, is, you know, a cry for help, but it's not a very useful cry for help.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And I think we've all had, you know, this experience of, you know, learning Zoom. I'm sure a lot of us have never used Zoom before, you know, moving online, and just, you know, Zoom was adding a lot of incredibly new features really quickly, and, you know, teachers have had to adapt, students have had to adapt. It's been, you know, a very confusing time for a lot of us. So we're around the 10-minute left mark, and we have a few questions. So I want to pass it off to Eric to start off the Q&A session.
Sure. So our first question is for Dr. Stevens, but of course, it's pretty applicable to all of you. So any of you can feel free to jump in and answer. But it's Dr. Stevens, to what degree do you think social interactions could truly go back to normal?
Oh, that's such a great question. I think it's weird already. And I think it's gonna be a while that it's weird. And I think it's almost counterproductive for us to think about going back to normal, because I think we're gonna kind of rewrite the direction that these interactions go in the future. You know, I'm planning to go to a small get together, the first one I've had now that I've reached immunity, for the first time next week. And I literally am losing sleep over it. I would never have imagined that in a million years, but I am like worried. And then I'm like, oh, I've got to wear shoes again because I haven't worn shoes. I just wear my socks around the house. And so there's so many things that we're going to have to rethink. And the other thing that I think is really, that has me personally worried, is I've loaned a few students books over the last year. And so we have met, and like, I'll put the book out, we'll wave from a distance, or they'll come get it from the trunk of my car or something like that. And what I never realized is how many times students would say really nice things and end their conversations with, can I just give you a hug? And we can't do that anymore. And it's been this awkward end to conversations, standing outside with them giving me a book back, telling me how much they learned from my class and how they're so excited about their future. And it just feels different. And so I think we're going to have to come up with new rituals for kind of ending our conversations that make people still feel positive about those interactions. I'm actually excited about seeing where we go with this next, because the whole hugging thing had gotten a little, you got to be careful, right, with hugs. And so, but I also am very worried that we're going to feel a little more distant. So I just would invite us all to not think about necessarily going back to normal, but instead creating some new rituals and some new ways to connect with people moving forward.
I think that's a really insightful answer. So yeah, thank you so much for going so deep into that. Dr. Spar, yeah.
Okay, so I just want to sort of throw out, this is my long-term refutable hypothesis. So a bit of background, when I was a kid growing up, it seemed that, like, you know, almost every other day, my parents, grandparents, older relatives would start a sentence with, well, during the war, we ... and you young people don't know you're born, blah, 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 blah. And so the Second World War was this enormous point of reference for people of, you know, the two generations above me, and everything that had happened to them since was framed in terms of this, you know, life-changing experience, especially for, you know, what we now term the greatest generation, those who were teenagers and, you know, in their early 20s during the war years. So my refutable hypothesis, you guys will be boring your grandkids by saying the sentence, well, during the pandemic, we, and so we will be using, you know, what happened during this year and a bit as a sort of reference point to make sense of whatever new challenges and technologies and opportunities pop up over the next 50 years. So yeah, call me back in 30 years and see if I'm right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Twidale. So we have another question in the chat for Dr. Spar. So an anonymous attendee is asking, were people able to find successful partners before the pandemic online, or has the success rate only increased after the pandemic started? And what makes online dating suddenly so much more successful?
Well, the trends towards online dating had occurred well before the pandemic. So that figure of 1/3 of marriages having come from online dating apps, that figure now is 4 or 5 years old. So the trend is moving in very strongly in that direction. Of course, during the pandemic, it was really the only way to meet people. So the numbers are just going to have to get stronger and stronger. And I think part of it's the stigma's gone away. You know, it used to be sort of something sleazy, you know, to look for partners online, but it's not anymore. It's, you know, if you read that great source of social data, the New York Times wedding, you know, people just regularly say, you know, they met on Bumble, they met on Tinder, whatever it is. And I think it works. You know, you lose something in the transition, but clearly it's working for many people. And it's not just young people meeting sort of the first or an early partner. It's divorced people, it's widowed people. And it turns out that the choice, and this is something that, you know, science is going to have to take a long time to figure out, but that when people are just responding super quickly to a visual image on their phone, they often make very good choices. So the matches that people make on the purely visual apps, the Tinders, have proven to be better, you know, more long lasting than the matches made by algorithms through Match.com and the others. So there's something, I mean, it's the digital equivalent of your eyes meeting across the room, but we respond to people in a visual way.
Thank you for the answer. That was also really insightful again. Dr. Stevens or Dr. Twidale, do you have anything to add?
No.
Okay.
I'm not super strong in online dating. I don't keep up with that literature. So Dr.
You know,
Spar, the expert
for
there.
social scientists, it's actually incredibly powerful data because there's so much of it now.
There
We
is
have
so much.
decades worth of data. It's pretty amazing.
It is fascinating. I mean, I read the stuff, but I'm certainly not an expert in it.
I want to jump in just one more on the earlier part, if I could. And I completely agree with Michael that we're going to look back at this moment forever. You know, it's a turning point in history. My prediction, in addition, is that I think we will value human interaction, physical interaction, even more highly. So yeah, we'll probably hug less frequently because we'll be scared, but those hugs are going to be extra good, you know, because we've missed them and we want them. Just like, you know, when people can go back to their first Broadway show, it's going to be incredibly special. Now you can get all kinds of media and all kinds of art forms on your computer right now, but I think we'll see this bifurcation. That shopping malls will probably go away or they'll be diminished, but so we'll buy like 80% of our stuff online, but then 20%, we want to be in Soho, we want to be in downtown London. So I think you're going to get a bifurcation. And I think you'll see it in education as well, that we'll get a massive explosion of the online market. But there's going to be people, and I presume you are all among them, who desperately want that physical campus interaction. So again, that bifurcation is going to be across society. That's my prediction. So I'll come back in 30 years too.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point. I hadn't thought about it that way before. So we have another question for Dr. Stevens in the Q&A. So about not having spontaneous conversation, do you think that classes with Zoom breakout rooms are counterproductive because of the lack of spontaneous conversations?
So I've done a lot of work on Zoom breakouts. I've written about it. I've been asked about it. First of all, I think that to make Zoom breakouts productive in the classroom, you have to plan the activities that happen in the Zoom breakouts, and there have to be accountability standards to make them work. However, the second half of that question has to do with, have you lost the spontaneity in the classroom by having breakouts? So you've lost the spontaneity in the classroom, period, whether you have breakouts or not. So what we're now doing instead, I know this sounds kind of nerdy, but we have planned spontaneity. So what I do is I randomly put people in breakout rooms and say, y'all, you need to meet each other. You're going to be peers in the class. We're going to spend time in class just letting y'all chat. But my only way to make that happen is through the mechanism of Zoom breakouts. But they actually have no agenda other than just meet each other and try to be spontaneous. It's probably the number one thing I miss about teaching is that I can't show up to class early and walk around and see somebody kind of slumped over and ask, hey, are you doing okay? I can't do that. I arrive to class early always, and I stay late. I plan that deliberately so that people can stay to talk with me, and it's convenient for students to do that. But I can't pick up on those subtle cues, the spontaneous conversations. Planned is just not as much fun is what it boils down to. It's hard to celebrate. Students will used to go catch me at the end of class and say, hey, I got that job offer we were talking about. And now they feel like they have to kind of make an appointment to come tell me they got a job offer. It's unfortunately planned spontaneity is the only way I've figured out to make it work. But structured breakouts are also good. But I will bet that most of the people who are teaching through breakouts are not doing it in an effective way right now, because there's very little training out there that helps you understand that when you don't have eyes on what's going on, it's very different than it is in the classroom. You might break up people, but you can hear those subtle cues. You can watch body language. You can figure out which groups need you. You lose that on Zoom breakouts.
So it's not strictly, spontaneous, bumping into people and discovering things, but just think about what we're doing now, where we're riffing off what each other is saying. And so it has an aspect of spontaneity, and it's a jolly sight more spontaneous than, say, a formal lecture by somebody with a bit of Q&A at the end. So I think it is entirely possible to facilitate this kind of, it's like in improv theater, yes, and where one person builds on somebody else's idea and the next person builds on. And if you can act as the facilitator, then you can enable, sort of like creative design or whatever it is that you're doing, software development, in these kinds of meetings. But it takes work, and it takes maybe even more work than, round a table, a very large table, or in a small lecture theatre. So I think it can be done in Zoom, but I want to build on Dr. Stevens' point. It's really hard to say, okay, go into your little rooms and you facilitate each other. It's like, if you were that good, you wouldn't be taking my class in the first place.
Dr. Spar, would you like to add anything before we move on to our final question? Okay, so I know we're a bit over, but we have one more question, if that's okay with the three of you. So the last question is for all of the panelists, and it's from Everett. So it was, how do you think social interactions can be improved online? Of course, you can't have a physical attachment, but do emojis or something of the like increase a feeling of being close?
So I'll just say a couple of quick things. I think we've had really good success with using virtual backgrounds. It sounds silly, and I'm not using one, but when you get rid of everyone's background and everyone has the same background, it enables people to focus more. I think, as I understand it, Zoom is working on the essential platform so that the tiles don't move, so that at least that part of your peripheral vision is not being taxed. Certainly having a bigger screen and fewer people really helps, so that you can see everyone in a stable fashion. And I'm of two minds of it, but chat's not bad. Like, at least it gives you, it's distracting, but at least it gives you some way of sorting, getting that emotional feedback loop of some sort. So I think, there's some things, and we're learning them. I would love to watch what really young kids are doing on Zoom. So this year's class of kindergartners or first graders, they're not going to school on Zoom. They're just going to school. To Michael's earlier point about technology, I would love to see how they have sort of learn to use the medium. And I bet we can learn things from people for whom this is going to wind up being at least a semi-native technology.
So there's probably a whole load of innovations going on, and I don't think we're very good at sharing them. So, you know, there's all this good stuff, but until it replicates out, everybody's having to reinvent it. And I think, you know, this is one of the same challenge with teaching as well. It's like when teaching, you know, you're the only professor and you've got a whole load of students, but you don't go into other professors' lectures. You don't necessarily see what's going on. And over time, universities have tried to make that more porous so we can learn from the techniques that others have done. So I suspect there's a whole load of innovation already happening that we just don't know about and need to share. One that intrigues me is I wonder what would happen if I had a really big screen on the wall opposite me, a few feet away, as opposed to talking to you when you're on my laptop and you're about 2 feet away from my eyes. And it's like, that's a very close kind, you know, there's only certain human beings who you spend that time that physically close to. It's a bit weird, you know, it's normally a very intimate kind of thing when your nose is only 2 feet away from somebody else. And so I wonder what would happen if we could put our displays at a more normal distance for when we're interacting with other human beings with whom we're not in intimate relationships. And I'm just curious, I wonder what that will do.
So I guess, this is about, you know, how social interactions can be improved online. First of all, I think it takes some effort. And I think things that we got used to being easy when we were in person, we have to work that much harder to do online. And I think we've given a lot of examples of that today, but I think that that's the best way that we can improve our interactions online right now. We're also needing to think out of the box. Everybody is really tired of just getting on Zoom and doing almost anything right now. And so I hope that when we all finish this semester, that we will take a deep breath and we'll get creative again whenever we get to take a break, and we'll come up with new ways of thinking about this and new ways of interacting. If I think about the students that I have, I've always, in the past, I probably have gotten to know a lot more of my students than I have online. And so I have done all kinds of things like tell my students just how important it is that they put their profile online and actually tell me something personal about them, because I have to work a lot harder to keep my students apart in my own mind. And so if people will tell me unique things about their background, it helps me get to know them better. And I think that that is playing into this notion of we just have to work harder at it. And the research literature says that the longer time that you interact with people, eventually you can approximate face-to-face conversation in a lot of situations. It just takes longer. We have to work a little harder.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the insights. I know it's 7:10 or 8:10 right now in Eastern time, I guess. So I don't think we have any other questions from the audience. So I just want to thank Dr. Spar, Dr. Stevens, and Dr. Twidale one last time for coming tonight and speaking to all of us. And I know everyone in the audience enjoyed it. I know for sure that I did, and I learned a lot of interesting points from each of your perspectives. So thank you again for coming out. And yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you all. Good luck.
Yes, thank you all.